How are your thoughts and priorities reflected in how you spend your time? It's a deep question, a real question, and something very much worth a 30-minute video over. But as a lifelong learner, I wanted to go into a specific area of how I spend my time. In other words, as a proud nerd, I wanted to dive into the thought of studying practices, while also presenting a challenge to you regarding the object, the act of study, is acting a font. I feel like my English teacher is showing here. I've always had a bit of the study bug, to the degree that I feel more like a walking portrait of jack of all trades, master of none with each passing year. And I'm just waiting to be informed that the internet will now use my name synonymously with a phrase, which, that kind of terrifies me and fuels my anxiety. But I feel like I've begun asking myself more reflective questions in regard to my studying practices. If my time on this earth is short, then it makes sense to me that the activities I spend the most time on ought to be analyzed the most. So what am I studying? How am I studying? How well am I studying? In other words, this is talking about process and how efficiently I have done the task of studying, which can often be measured by memory retention and the like. These are the things that I think about because I am that person. These kinds of questions are ultimately relying on metacognition, which means to think about thinking. If you're looking into how to study better, definitely study metacognition. So here's a fine-tuned challenge for this video. How are your values and priorities reflected in what and how you study? And when I say study, I'm not just talking about picking up a textbook or studying for an exam, although those play a part. One definition for the word study is the devotion of time and attention to acquiring knowledge on an academic subject, especially by means of books. However, a second definition reads like this: a detailed investigation and analysis of a subject or situation. In other words, in my humble opinion, this gives room for essentially anything to be an object of study. For example, puppies could be an object of study. If you are spending hours watching puppy videos, I would say that you have spent hours studying puppies intensely, and you are probably a happier person for it. Now, not all purposes of study are the same, and of course, not all studies are studied efficiently. If you're anything like me, maybe your study patterns are heavily skewed, and perhaps you spend more time studying puppies than you do studying a skill or studying for an exam. Perhaps studying puppies is your fuel for studying for an exam. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. I'm not saying that we must always be perfectly balanced, but I am saying that if you're feeling a little chaotic, this might be an interesting challenge to think about, because if what we value most or what is most important to us is not what is taking up the most of our time, I do believe it plays out in our emotional and mental health. For example, let's say that your family is most important to you. What part of your day is spent studying, learning about your spouse or partner, asking about their day, asking about what kinds of things they are looking forward to this week, what kinds of things are heavy on their hearts, what kind of things they're dreading? If your answer is that a large amount of your time is spent in that way, then I would venture to say that your values are in line with how you're spending your time. And in all truth, you are likely able to have a sense of satisfaction and contentment with this because your time is in line with your top value. Pause here to say that we have many different values, right? And a lot of the time they play out in tandem with each other, and sometimes we have to spend more time doing something of less ultimate priority for us so that we can do more of our first priority later. But I do believe that many, if not most of us, have something or someone that we want to keep first in our life. So this is how I arrived at this question. It didn't arrive at me being satisfied and content with my answer of how I'm spending my time, that's for sure. For me, God is first. If you aren't a Christian or religious, still follow along with me because I think it could still serve as a resource. For those who are religious, perhaps it will land close to home. When I asked myself that question, I realized that I am utterly employed with the content and quality of my studies. Metacognition, reflections, me, and recall games were close, like buddies. Like something might be wrong with me that I like to study so intensely, kind of close. But when I was reading Jen Wilkins' Women of the Word, a really fantastic book about biblical literacy and that hosts a very good structured framework for Bible study, I realized very quickly that I often cop out of effective learning practices directed towards my Bible study for the sake of time, convenience, and opportunity loss, which is wild to me because I am the girl who will write up a 40-page reflection regarding my philosophy, practices, and plan of execution of those practices for teaching TOEFL just for funds. But for some reason, I can't spare 30 minutes for what I know to be of even more worth to me than a crazy long thesis that I will likely never use. It's wild. But it's real for me because I can be very double minded, but I don't want to be. And thus, I ask myself all the questions and ultimately know that keeping my first priority first will provide more emotional stability and life satisfaction, which sounds good, no? Like, let's do that. Now, I'm not saying that I shouldn't maintain a level of grace and practice self forgiveness for the days that I'm stretched thin, weighed down, or am just running around like a crazy person. But I do believe that if I'm saying that God is number one, the one, my one, then that should be reflected in the time I study the Word and study God. Just like how if I said my spouse was my top priority and who I wanted to spend the most time studying, then it should be reasonably reflected in the time spent with my spouse. So let's ask the question again. How are your values and priorities reflected in what and how you study? It's my hope to become a person who's consistent, and someone who studies well, and who uses her study time to reflect her priorities. If that's something that interests you as well, try asking yourself this question. And I would love to hear what you come up with in the comments, because ultimately, while we must hold ourselves accountable, that is easier to do when we are surrounded by a loving community. So, hi, welcome to this community. You are so loved. So, 10-minute thoughts study complete. Peace to you all, and peace out.